this chapter, we're going to talk about health and nutrition. How does health vary between different human groups, and do different human groups require different nutrition, right? So we're really going to talk about how, as a single species, we really don't have a whole lot of differences in terms of health conditions that are specific to one quote-unquote human group, and we're also going to come to find out that a lot of health conditions, a lot of nutrition-based conditions, are really related to how we have set up our societies and how we have set up our culture, and a lot of our cultural ideas surrounding food and what is considered acceptable to eat and what's considered not acceptable. So the essential questions we'll be dealing with in this lecture will be: what role does nutrition and health play in human biological diversity? Essentially, we're going to look at what role does diet play in terms of intersecting with our health in various parts of the world and within different human groups. Is there such a thing as racial illness? This is kind of a very loaded question. I'm going to give you a bit of a spoiler alert here. There is no such thing as a racial illness. There are, if you go and you look at the statistics, there are patterns that indicate that certain diseases such as heart disease and things like that and diabetes affect certain quote-unquote racial groupings more than others. And what we're going to learn is that that's more related to socioeconomic status and access to wealth care than it really is to do with biology. And then we're going to look at how does culture, or the cultural practice of medicine, affect human diversity. So let's start way back in the beginning, the last 10,000 years, something that we refer to as the Holocene period. What we see during this period, or at the very beginning, is the agricultural beginnings in the Old World. This is when we are just discovering how to conduct agriculture. If we look in the New World at this time, we have big game hunting and gathering as a food acquisition strategy in the New World, right? This is where you're hunting large game animals and you're relying exclusively off of what is growing in the area for your subsistence. During this time, the estimated population at the start of this period was between 5 to 10 million people worldwide. And to just kind of give you an indication of how we're going to or how to look at how human diet is supposed to be comprised, based off of scientific studies and behavioral studies with our closest living primates, we know that humans themselves are supposed to be adapted to eat around 30 to 50% meat and 50 to 7% fruits and vegetables. It wasn't until we had an interesting mutation that occurred in our genome that actually even allowed us to process things like cereal grains or dairy, right? So in terms of evolutionary history, humans in themselves, originally, we weren't developed to eat grain nor dairy at all. It wasn't until relatively recently that those mutations allowed us to process those things and thus start the kind of development towards building agriculture as a cultural practice. So you might hear in the book and elsewhere this kind of time period referred to as quote-unquote the Stone Age, right? And how we kind of moving from the old Stone Age to the new Stone Age, right? Something that we call the Paleolithic versus the Neolithic age. For example, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia developed writing thousands of years before writing was used by European tribes, right? The time period when Sumerians were literate and Europeans were illiterate is considered historical, right? So the Stone Age, in essence, is divided into two parts. So I don't want you to think that all of a sudden, there's some sort of time line, and then after that, it's all of a sudden the new Stone Age or the Neolithic period all across the globe. Technological innovations and things like that kind of caused the shift in these ages occurred at various places at various times, right? So one group might have written language but not agriculture, right? Another group might have agriculture but not written language, right? It's really kind of when these certain technologies were invented is when we consider the shift in that age from Old Stone Age to New Stone Age. So just to give you a brief overview of kind of this time period, which also is referred to as kind of the last ice age, we have humans, which are nomadic hunter-gatherers, spread out across the globe in bands of 25 to 70 people in search of game and edible plants, right? In essence, what we were doing is we were following those big game animals out of Africa into different parts of the world, right? Essentially following our food. The ice created a bridge between what we now know as Siberia and Alaska. This is called the Beringian Pass. The humans crossed this bridge to North America and then spread to South America pretty quickly following the coastline and major river systems. And then the Ice Age ended at or about 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 BCE, leaving humans living all over the world, right? So by that 10,000-year mark, humans are living in all different parts of the world, right, including South America and Asia. The ice bridge between Siberia and Alaska melts around that 8,000 BCE period, leaving humans in the Americas separated from the rest of the world, right? That's how we kind of had that big separation, and that's how Europeans kind of, quote, rediscovered the Americas. So as time progresses, temperatures steadily increase, right, creating longer growing seasons. The ice continues to recede, making the land drier and better for growing plants. During the Ice Age, a lot of large game animals were hunted to extinction, like woolly mammoths, and this is kind of a misnomer. This is something you're going to see in the literature a lot, that we really kind of hunted these creatures to extinction. They were already on their way to extinction before humans even began kind of hunting them, right? Think about it this way. Those large creatures were adapted, based on our discussions of evolution, were adapted for a specific kind of environment. As that ice melted, as those temperatures changed, right, those large-bodied, cold-adapted creatures became less fit for the environment over time, right? So it's not that we really exclusively hunted them to existence. We just kind of killed off the last remnants that were still around after the major die-off. So the invention of farming allowed people to maintain a steady food supply. So we were no longer reliant on moving around as this kind of nomadic existence, continually in search of food, right? We were able to kind of make more investment in the land, create little towns and villages and hamlets, and kind of make that cultural shift to settling down into permanent settlements. So before agriculture, kind of the firm establishment of agriculture in various parts of the world, what were people using as their subsistence strategy? Well, you have, of course, hunting and gathering, which we talked about, which is obtaining all of your food from the surrounding environment without growing anything. You also have wild crop watching, right, which is while you're kind of out in the wild, you know which species produce food, and you start to remove their competitors that are growing around them. So you're not purposefully planting anything, but what you're doing is you're kind of allowing those plants a little more room to grow, and a little more, you're removing the competition from the wild for them. And then, of course, all of this leads to a process of domestication, which is the purposeful promoting of specific dietary plants via planting, or animals via domestication. So going back to what we were talking about a few slides ago with the differences between the Neolithic and the Paleolithic period, right? The Neolithic, we said, was otherwise called the New Stone Age, right? And what really marks this transition is the domestication of animals and early cultigens, as well as the development of pottery, right? And remember that that transition to domestication occurred in various places at various times, right? There were also a lot of changes in health and social organization that occurred rapidly during this time period as humans began to settle down into more permanent settlements. So the Neolithic is also sometimes referred to as the agricultural revolution, right, which began at or around 10,000 years ago. And remember, that shift took place over many centuries and in several locations around the world. And although researchers largely agree on when and where the shift took place, they don't generally agree on the cause, right? Why did people really invest in this thing called agriculture, right? Because for thousands of years we had done hunting and gathering, and it had worked just fine for a lot of our human groups, right? So why did we make this shift to settling down in permanent villages and beginning to grow crops? So in essence, the pattern that we've seen at this kind of 10,000-year mark is that we're starting to see a decreasing dependence over time on wild plants for food, and an increasing dependence on domesticated plants for food, all the way up until we are today, in which we are fully committed and fully reliant upon domesticated plants for all of our food subsistence. So just to give you an example, this graphic here shows you kind of the various timelines in which agriculture was independently invented in these different regions, right? We have some places as early as 9,000 BCE. We have some places as late as 1,000 BCE, which is actually kind of interesting because I'll tell you that the one they have for the eastern United States is actually incorrect, and I know this based off of my own research that I did for my master's thesis. So in essence, this kind of transition took place at various times and in various places, right? Essentially cultivating and domesticating whatever plants were in that local area that were really beneficial to the humans in terms of subsistence. This is just showing you some of the different areas in which some of the common day crops that we use today originated. I always find it kind of interesting because tomatoes, for example, originated in South America, and up until about 500 years ago, they weren't really a part of Italian cuisine at all, but now tomatoes are a part of Italian cuisine, so you kind of see how that shift. Sugarcane, in essence, started in Southeast Asia, right? And think about how important sugar is to our kind of daily diets today. It's basically in everything. Looking at other things, like you have apples coming from Eastern Europe. Of course, you have coffee coming from Ethiopia, as well as corn, maize, coming from Mexico. We have two kind of competing theories behind why humans kind of invested in this practice of domestication. We have the population pressure theory, which states that as populations rose within these areas, people were forced to invent domestication in order to sustain life, right? Because domestication or domesticated foods allows us to grow enough to obtain a food surplus. We also have the sedentism, that is somewhere there was a cultural shift to settling down in more permanent villages and hamlets, and then the after effect of that was the invention of agriculture. So agriculture, in essence, led to surpluses, which increased or led to the availability of time and effort so that cultural complexity could increase. So in essence, what we really did here was we developed agriculture as a way to increase our fertility, right? And we know this by, the data speaks for itself, right? As soon as the agricultural revolution happens, right, at around 10,000 BP, you have only 2 to 5 million people. Worldwide, around 2000 BP, you have 250 million people worldwide. By 1850, you have over 1 billion people worldwide. So, right, this agriculture and this process of domestication really allowed for us to double our fertility, to create this kind of exponential growth in human populations. So looking at one of the regional variations that was mentioned in that regional variation model, and all that is just a fancy way of saying that agriculture was invented in different places at different times. Let's look at one region called Levant in Asia, right? That's kind of our classic cradle of civilization, as they call it. So at the end of the Pleistocene period, this area saw intense harvesting of wheat and barley ancestors. The manipulation of plant cycles, at least archaeologically, we can prove goes as far back as 11,500 BP. And in the Jordan Valley, agriculture spread across the entire Fertile Crescent by 8,000 BP, right? So this is something that was invented and spread relatively rapidly, right? And some of the villages that were founded during this time, like Jericho, are actually still cities that exist today. If we look at one of our earliest settlements that you saw a kind of drawing of a few slides ago, we have Katal Hayuk, which is one of the world's very first permanent settlements. It was populated between 7,500 and 5,700 BCE. It's located in what is now Turkey. The population had a population of approximately 6,500 people. There were around 1,000 dwellings crammed together in this kind of honeycomb-like structure. There were no streets, right? So people essentially climbed out of their homes using ladders in the ceilings, right? And that's how you would kind of move around from building to building across the roofs. It was supported by agriculture and animal domestication. They grew the ancestors for barleys, different types of peas, as well as wheat, and domesticated cattle and sheep. Hayok itself is famous because it is so well preserved, right? Archaeologically, we've been able to determine quite a lot about the site because of that really good preservation, right? So, and just to know, the oldest known village in the world existed in Jericho, which is in modern day Israel, right around 9000 BCE. So this is just showing you some of the timelines and the different types of cultigens that were used in these various parts of the world. If we're looking at the river, the Nile River Valley in Africa, you have wheat and barley being grown around 5000 BC, most likely coming via diffusion from the Middle East. We have Central America and Mexico around 5000 BC, growing the sacred triad, which is corns, beans, and squash. We have China at 6000 BC growing millet, as well as rice appearing around 5000 BC. We have the Indus River Valley in India with cotton around 5000 BCE. We have Iraq, of course, Mesopotamia, and that Fertile Crescent, with the agriculture starting as far back as 11,500 BC, but really becoming cemented as a cultural practice by 5000 BC across the whole Fertile Crescent. And then around 3000 BC, we have agriculture developing in Peru with things like tomatoes and potatoes. And one thing I want you guys to kind of understand is that there are actually more extinct cultigens that exist than there are being used today, right? Which, in other words, more of the things that we have grown as agricultural products in the past have gone extinct than there are actually existing today. So in essence, agriculture itself as a practice for humans is an adaptive trade-off, right? It allows population growth, right? So domestication fueled human population growth. It formed the basis for complex societies and technologies, and plants were used as both sources of food and drink, right? And we know that today 2/3 of humans' necessary calorie and protein intake comes from key cereal grains or their ancestors that were domesticated in that early Holocene period. So one of the consequences of the development of agriculture, of course, is environmental degradation, right? Cultural and technological changes also have caused negative changes to occur throughout our evolutionary history. Populations, in essence, have increased from 2 million to more than 7 billion in the last 10,000 years. And what this has done is it's caused competition for resources, which has strained the global environment, right? So what we're seeing is that as human populations increase, the carrying capacity and sustainability of the environment begins to decrease. So what was our trade-off for this boom in population, right? Well, of course, it is environmental degradation, right? And we know that this is well documented at or around 10,000 years ago. So the process of domesticating and raising plants and animals affects local ecology as well as world biodiversity, right? By promoting some species over others, right, we effectively are limiting world biodiversity, right? An unchecked human population growth could lead to food crises as we use up all the arable land, right? And I know it sounds very doom and gloom and that we don't really have any way out at this point, but as humans, and as I'm hoping that you have learned throughout the semester so far, is that we are a highly adaptable species. And not only that, we have this thing called knowledge and technology and culture, which allows us to develop things to respond to the various changes that are occurring in our environment, right? So as humans, really what we need to do is put our heads together and figure out a way to sustainably live on the planet without causing too much environmental degradation. So let's take a look at animal domestication here for a second, and very, very important because I know in a lot of Western Civ classes and in history courses, they will tell you that the first animal to be domesticated was your cows, your oxen, and your sheep, things like that, but they were not. In fact, the very first animal to be domesticated was your average household dog, right? And this was around 15,000 BP, and we actually know, we've even found purposeful animal burials for dogs dogs that are as old as 30 to 40,000 years ago. So even our kind of ancestors, even as far back as Homo neanderthalensis, were living alongside dogs and keeping them as pets. And it wasn't until around between that 10 to 5,000 BP mark that we see the domestication of the larger draft animals like oxen and sheep. So what effects does domestication and agriculture have on human health overall? Well, this is really what has allowed overnutrition to become possible within kind of using wide-scale agriculture, right? This is where humans now have the capability to acquire more calories, far more calories than they actually need on a daily basis. We have changes that occurred in the V103L and the I251L genes, which allowed for increased fat deposition. We have also seen a rise in cardiovascular disease, cancer, and infectious diseases like smallpox, syphilis, and influenza, right? And more importantly, I want to kind of go back to this idea about the 103 and 251L genes. These are kind of important because in our ancient history, these genes were very useful. They allowed for increased fat deposition. So if you're a human living 15,000 years ago and you're moving from herd of animal to herd of animal, kind of hunting for a living, you're going to need that increased fat deposition because you're going to go through times or time periods in which food is not as plentiful, right? So it becomes environmentally, it becomes evolutionarily advantageous for you to have that fat deposition gene turned on, right? Well, unfortunately, we've developed agriculture, we've kind of taken that pressure off of, but those genes are still turned on, right? So if you have both of those genes that are still kind of active within your genome, you're going to have a higher degree of fat deposition and a lot harder of a time trying to lose that fat deposition. So in essence, health and the agricultural revolution, right? We started to have this thing called population crowding, which led to the development of infectious disease, right? So increased population size and density caused the spread of more infectious diseases, and diet itself was also affected, right? And we know this because archaeologists and paleoanthropologists can look at the bones of these ancient humans, and it can reveal the presence of infectious illnesses even after hundreds of years of being in the ground, right? And studies suggest that treponematoses diseases affected many of the early human populations around the world, right? And another disease that we're familiar with today, tuberculosis, right, was also found very, very early in human history. So in essence, what I hope you've gotten up until this point is that there are some serious pros and cons to living in a settled community as a human, right? Some of those pros include, well, of course, you guys have a common culture expressed. You get mutual protection in your village, right? The other village members will help protect you and vice versa. You'll be near your farms, right? So you have more investment in the village, right? Or more investment in the land. And you're not really traveling all the time, right? And you also have grain and seed storage, right? So you have the ability to build surplus food. Some of the cons, on the other hand, are disease will spread more rapidly amongst a dense population, and you are providing more opportunities for diseases to mutate and change and for new diseases to develop. Grain stores, of course, are very, very tempting for neighboring raiders of other human groups that may not be as good or efficient at farming as your village is. And permanent settlements suffered from natural disasters, right? You become more susceptible to things like drought, fire, and floods, right? Because you have invested your time, energy, and you are connected to that land, right? If there's a fire or a drought, you simply just can't pick up and move, right? You'll lose all of your agricultural product. So let's take a look briefly at some of the nutrition-based diseases that we still see present throughout the human populations today. We're going to look at things like yaws and syphilis. We're going to look at things like kwashiorkor as well as a few others. So yaws is a health condition that's caused by a treponemal disease called Treponema pertinu, which closely resembles that of Treponema pallidum, which is the little microorganism that causes syphilis, right? The agents are found in the epidermis of the lesions, right, that you saw on the individual's face in the prior photo. The lesions or the agents of the disease can also be found in lymph glands, the spleen, and as well as bone marrow. And the organism rapidly dies outside of the tissues, right? This is why it doesn't provide a huge kind of infectious spread, right? Man or humans are the only known reservoir for yaws, right? And the clinical lesions that you see in the image in the prior slide will relapse 2 or 3 times or more during the first 5 years of infection and serve as a new source for new infections, right? So the most latent cases are found in clusters centered on an infectious case. So in essence, yaws itself can be spread to other people who are coming into contact with these infectious lesions, but it's not as kind of virulent as, let's say, another treponemal disease like tuberculosis is. This image shows you kind of the damage that can be done to the bone tissue in a kind of tertiary case of syphilis, right? This is one that is very, very far along, very progressed, very advanced, and this individual most likely died of the resulting complications from the damage that syphilis has done to the skeleton as well as the organs and tissues. And looking at our treponemal disease here, right, we talked a little bit about this, which is tuberculosis. The kind of primary symptoms that we see are things like appetite loss and fatigue. Of course, you have painful coughing as well as possibly coughing up blood. And in terms of your skin, you'll actually have night sweats as well as a pallor to your skin. And this is just showing you this is another disease that really didn't exist up until humans decided to start living in large communities and groups. There are also other consequences that we may not really think about. The one that is related to my research is the kind of tooth decay, right, or dental caries or cavities, right? And these have increased after certain plants, like corn, were introduced because these plants cause changes in oral bacteria, right? So in essence, we really didn't see a whole lot of cavities and dental disease and decay before the advent of agriculture. As soon as agriculture was invented, we see this explosion of dental problems amongst various human groups, right? We also see the development of nutritional disorders or deficiency diseases, right, which are occur due to a lack of essential nutrients, right, which leads to reduced growth as well as abnormal development, right? So in essence, what this will do, if we use an example, we use lysine from corn, or having a lack of lysine from a corn-heavy diet can cause iron deficiency anemia. And it's actually a really interesting process how that happens, right? Corn itself has something in it called phytate. And phytate acts like a glue which binds to the iron that you're eating and prevents your body from absorbing it. So if you're eating a diet in which you're eating a whole lot of corn, it really doesn't matter how much iron you're eating either, because that corn is going to keep it from your body or keep your body from absorbing it. This is my kind of public service announcement slide here, or my PSA. I throw this up here because I want you to see exactly kind of the etiology or the progression of how a cavity really forms. You can notice that the kind of surface, or where the cavity appears on the surface of the tooth, the hole is actually quite small. But as you kind of move into the area of decay, you notice that once you get inside the tooth, the area of decay is much, much larger. And if you can see right below where in between those two black areas, you can actually see where the enamel and the dentin had started to become discolored, where that decay was going to spread next, right? So as my public service announcement, if you have a cavity, even if you think it doesn't look that bad, it's most likely much bigger than you actually think it is. So go to the dentist, get it taken care of, because once that decay reaches that pulp chamber right in the middle of the tooth, that's when you start to have abscesses, and you get an increased risk of having a very, very serious infection, which could kill you. This is to kind of give you an example of what we mean by saying that dental problems kind of exploded once agriculture was invented or introduced to an area. This is showing you what happened in the prehistoric period of the eastern woodlands of North America. So in essence, this is showing you We break it up into different time periods like early, middle, and late woodland. So just to show you, the Archaic period is the earliest on the chart, and the Contact period is the most recent. So what we're seeing here is right around that middle woodland period, you start to see corn being adopted as a major agricultural component to a lot of Native American diets in all of these different tribes east of the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. So what we see is as we move to that late woodland period where all of these people have really invested, they're basically all growing corn, we start to see the incidence or the percentage of teeth with dental cavities skyrocket, right? And it stays up there all the way to the point where Europeans make contact with Native American groups, right? So that corn really facilitated, for lack of better terms, the rot in a lot of Native American teeth that are seen in the archaeological record during this time period. Also, another unintended side effect of agriculture is we start to get the development of gum disease and fossilized plaque, right, otherwise known as dental calculus. In essence, what's happening here is as we've shifted our diets to eating more starchy foods, more grains, rather than kind of fruits, vegetables, and meats, we kind of have created this environment in our mouth in which starch begins to collect and stick right at the gum line, right? And that's what causes kind of that plaque to form, and later the calculus to form, and then later, if you don't get it addressed, right, you have really serious conditions like we see in the image on the bottom right, where the person has very severe and developed dental disease. Some other health conditions that we see on a large scale during this time period worldwide is we see large increases in cases of iron deficiency, anemia, right? And we know this because when we look at a lot of these ancient populations, whether we're looking at Africa, Europe, North America, we see this condition in the skull called parotid hyperostosis, and we have something called cribral orbitalia, both of which you'll see images of here in a second. And what this is indicating to us is that these individuals in essence, are not getting enough iron in their diet to maintain healthy bone growth. We also see another nutritional consequences. Heights are on the decline, right? Across the world, increases in adult height have stopped, right? If you paid close attention to our talk on evolution and kind of the history of the human timeline, you notice that when we first started out becoming bipedal, we were very short, 3.5 feet, 4 feet tall. Our little Arties and our little Lucies were very short creatures. As we moved into kind of more human-like ancestors like Homo erectus, that's when we really started getting into modern adult human heights, around 6 feet tall. But what we've noticed is that we're actually on the back end of that. Human heights are starting to decrease through time now rather than continue to increase. And we know that this is not an adaptive response to poor food resources because we don't see it happening. There's no variation in why this is happening, right? We see it happening in human groups that have very adequate levels of nutrition as well as human groups that do not have adequate levels of nutrition over time. So why was iron deficiency so prevalent in human groups kind of before the advent of kind of modern health, modern medicine? Well, in a lot of cases, it was too much reliance on corn, wheat, or rice as a staple crop. We also have phosphorus, right? Foods which are very high in phosphorus combine to the iron within your body and make it unusable, right? So if you're eating a diet that's very heavy in wild nuts, fish, or whole grains, right, you can actually be consuming enough phosphorus to act as a blocker to your iron intake. You also have too much non-heme iron in your diet, which is iron from plants like legumes, and we know that it's not as efficiently absorbed as heme iron or iron from meat, right? In essence, what we're looking at is it's taking two different ways to break down a protein here. It takes a lot more effort, a lot more biochemical activity to break down that non-heme iron than it does to break down the heme iron. So let's take a minute to look at the various nutritional disorders that we see today in varying human groups. And they're kind of broken up into two broad categories, right? And they are starkly different between what would be considered the developing world, or i.e. second and third world nations, versus what we would call quote-unquote Western society, or otherwise known as first world nations, right? So I don't want you to think it's just Western society. Any country that has a modern first world economic system. So if we look at Western society, this is where we see a prevalence of overnutrition disorders. And in developing societies or developing nations, this is where we see a prevalence of undernutrition disorders. Going back to that classic scourge that has been with us since the beginning, that iron deficiency anemia, 60 to 80% of the world's population could technically be classified as iron deficient. 30%, or roughly 2 billion people worldwide, have iron deficiency anemia. It disproportionately affects children rather than adults, and it can lead to low birth weight, impaired cognitive, as well as physical development, right? And this is something that we really don't notice right off rip, right? Because it doesn't cause enough health effects to the individual on a daily basis to really make it seem like they have a disease process going on. So in essence, unless you go to the doctor and really get your iron levels checked, there's not really much of a way to tell until you get some of these really bad side effects like cribriformitalia and parotid hyperostosis that you really know that you're iron deficient. So in terms of looking at evidence of malnutrition and starvation, we look at something called enamel hypoplasias, which can be found on the teeth. You can actually see an image of it, and you can see that there are two distinct horizontal lines going across that tooth, right? So in essence, episodes of starvation, or in some cases bouts of infectious disease, cause the formation of tooth enamel to get disrupted, right? In essence, it disrupts the functions of the ameloblasts, which are the name of the cells that produce your enamel, right? So what your body is essentially doing is it's shutting down all the extra stuff that's not really necessary for just basic survival, and your enamel is one of those things. And once you start getting adequate nutrition again, your body switches those ameloblasts back on, you start producing enamel again, and that's what causes the formation of that horizontal line that you see. So we can look at someone's teeth and tell whether or not they have gone through episodes of starvation or really bad infectious disease throughout their own life history. So some other nutritional deficiency diseases we will talk about real quick, things like beriberi, which is what you get if you rely too heavily on rice as a staple diet item. And this is caused by a B1 or thiamine deficiency. You also have pellagra, which is caused by niacin deficiency. You can have chronic migraines, which are caused by vitamin E or vitamin K deficiency. You have Goiter Syndrome, which of course is caused by a lack of iodine. You could have rickets, which you probably have already come across in your textbook when talking about the vitamin D cycle and skin tone. And of course, you have scurvy, right? The good old-fashioned pirate's disease that comes from having a lack of vitamin C. Thiamine, or vitamin B1, is a water-soluble vitamin, like most vitamins, and is an essential coenzyme for the metabolism of carbohydrates, right? So if you have a thiamine deficiency, you're not going to be able to as efficiently metabolize carbohydrate-heavy foods. The result of a thiamine deficiency results in something called beriberi disease, which isn't really a disease in the sense that it's a disease process. It's a disease in the sense that you're consuming carbohydrates, yet your body has a lack of thiamine and doesn't really know what to do with them, so you get this kind of inflammatory response that occurs, which results in these skin lesions. We have another essential vitamin or nutrient here. We have nicotinic acid, otherwise known as niacin, is also involved in the carbohydrate metabolism and plays a vital role in the functioning of the skin, gastrointestinal tract, as well as the central nervous system and hemopoietic system, right, or your blood production system. This vitamin may be obtained either from the natural food sources or from the tryptophan endogenously, right? The natural food sources for this include things like milk, liver, pork, cheese, yeast, and some cereal grains. This is showing you a condition called pellagra, which in essence is a complete breakdown of your ability to produce healthy skin cells, and this occurs from a lack of niacin within your body. Then, of course, we have a Goiter Syndrome, which is a condition that affects people worldwide today. It's caused by an iodine deficiency, and it is the main cause of mental degradation in the modern world, right? And affects roughly 750 million people worldwide, and the effects of which are passed from generation to generation, right? Women give birth to children suffering from something called cretinism, which is caused by a lack of iodine within the mother during fetal development. If we look at vitamin D deficiencies, it causes three distinct conditions. You have tetany, as well as rickets, and osteomalacia. Osteomalacia is frequently called adult rickets, and it occurs when there is a lack of vitamin D as well as calcium within the body, and it may also occur when there is an interference with fat absorption and hence also vitamin D absorption. Essentially what this causes is this kind of porous development in the bone where you're getting a lot of holes, and it leaves you more susceptible to things like fractures and bone degradation. Tetany itself is a little more rare and a little more kind of acute in terms of its presentation. This is characterized by having a low serum calcium, less than 7.5 milligrams per 100 milliliters, and it can lead to muscle twitching, cramps, and convulsions. It results from insufficient absorption of calcium or vitamin D, or from a disturbance in the parathyroid gland. If we look at rickets, it has several clinical features which can be seen. If we look at the head, you have an increased size and delayed closure of the fontanelles in children. If we look at the teeth, you have delayed formation of your dentition. If you look at the thorax, you have a ricketic rosary and a pigeon chest. We're actually going to take a look at that here in a second. If we look at the spine, you could have scoliosis as well as kyphosis, right, which are just denoting different bends in the spine. If we look at the limbs, you have a widening of wrists, ankles, and other epiphyses, as well as a genovalgum, right, which causes kind of a malformation or a kind of warping of the bone. Scurvy today is generally seen in infants, which age between 6 months and 2 years. But just so you know, there's really no bar in terms of ages. You can actually acquire or develop scurvy at any point during your time. But we have the most information on infantile scurvy, right, which is characterized by gross irritability, excessive crying, and tenderness to the touch. More so in the lower limbs, right? The infant adopts a so-called frog position. The posture of the lower limbs gives an impression as though these are paralyzed, right? And this is caused by that malformation. We also have palpable subperiosteal hemorrhage into the lower third of the femur, which may contribute to the irritability because it causes pain, thus preventing movements of the leg further and strengthening the impression that the lower limbs may be paralyzed, right? And in the image we're going to see next is we're going to see a couple different conditions in this particular infant. We're going to see the ricketic rosary chest, right? And that's going to show you the rib cage, which looks like it has these little beads going down the side of it. You're going to notice that the rib cage itself is malformed into kind of a bird-breasted shape, what we call something being pigeon-chested, right? And all of these conditions can occur with both vitamin D deficiency as well as scurvy. Deficiencies of vitamin A really affect mostly your eyes more than any other kind of system or region of your body. It can cause night blindness as well as ocular lesions or cutaneous lesions. It can cause Bateau spots within the eye. It can also cause xerophthalmia, which is just a very fancy way for saying excessive dryness of the conjunctiva. So really having a deficiency in vitamin A can really have some deleterious side effects for your vision. If we look at vitamin K deficiency, what we see today in terms of on a wide scale is something called hemorrhagic disease of the newborn. Newborn infants that are deficient in vitamin K because the minimal stores of vitamin K at birth. There could be a lack of established intestinal flora for endogenous synthesis of vitamin K and limited dietary intake since breast milk is a poor source of vitamin K. And what this leads to is something called a biliary obstruction, in which bile is prevented from entering the bowel due to an obstruction so that this fat-soluble vitamin cannot be absorbed, right? So even if you have a vitamin K deficiency, your body kind of develops these mechanisms which further prevent your ability to absorb vitamin K efficiently. We also have lack of protein disorders, or what we call protein energy malnutrition disorders, and they present in two primary manifestations. We have marasmus, which occurs from having a low-calorie, low-protein diet. Essentially, it's a starvation diet. And then we have something called kwashiorkor, which is a high-carbohydrate, low-protein diet, and this is where you see that kind of bloated belly, or what they call the kind of carb bloat that occurs, right? So one of them is essentially a wasting disease, whereas the other is a disease that occurs from having too much of one particular dietary element and not enough of the other. So it's kind of important to note how definitions have shifted over time in the modern world, right? Malnutrition was once used to refer to not acquiring enough nutrients from the surrounding environment, but malnutrition now refers to overnutrition as well, otherwise known as obesity, right? And recommended daily allowances are based on population averages. So don't really get into the idea that these kind of recommended daily amounts that you're supposed to have are going to be the end-all, tell-all of what your nutrition is supposed to be. That is going to vary dramatically amongst a given individual as well as amongst different human groups, depending on the nutritional availability of their environment, right? So there really is no kind of common diet that is absolutely necessary for all humans, right? It's really the kind of what's necessary is getting these kind of essential nutrients that we need, right? So it doesn't really matter how you get the essential nutrients as long as you are getting them and you're not becoming over-nutriented, right? And kind of these malnutrition disorders affect roughly 800 million people worldwide in terms of these over-malnutrition disorders. In terms of your caloric intake, you will have a gradual shift as you age throughout your life. As a juvenile and adolescent, you'll have a high caloric intake as needed as you are still growing, but as you shift to adult and to elderly, you will have a slow decrease in the requirements you need for caloric intake. So if it's so bad for you, why did we farm, right? If farming led to the increase in infectious diseases, it led to the increase in nutritional deficiency disorders, why did we as a species adopt its practice? Well, agricultural practices increase human fertility dramatically, right? Average fertility rates increase by as much as 70% after the introduction of agriculture, and this means that there are more calories per land unit and more food resources for population increases. All right, so let's shift and kind of go full circle here. So we talked about the development of agriculture, kind of why we have agriculture and what our kind of needs are as a species in general. So let's look at how nutrition varies in kind of our modern world today, right, particularly in America. So food insecurity in general is on a decline in the U.S., right? So although on a decline, food security still affects minorities at a higher rate. And food security or food insecurity is often cyclic, right? So this whole notion that you don't have or you're afraid that you don't have enough to eat kind of runs on a cycle throughout your life, right? Which really kind of goes back to show you it really relates much to our evolutionary history, right? There are times of plenty and there are times of scarcity. So, if we have this kind of modern food system, why do we see nutritional deficiencies still present in places like the United States? And it's really because of these kind of cultural practices and these kind of patterns that have developed, right? One of them that we talk about in cultural anthropology is this notion of a food desert, where you have these locations where low-income individuals live where there are no grocery stores, where the only option you have is to go to the kind of lower quality food sources to acquire your nutrition. So when we talk about obesity, which is a kind of hot button common issue that we deal with in the United States, we have to start off with a few basic assumptions, right? Women tend to have higher fat deposition than men. That's just an average pattern amongst humans, and that's required because, well, women burn through a lot of fat when they are nursing and when they are carrying a fetus, right? So they need that extra fat deposition in order to be able to sustain the development of a baby. Obesity is common in affluent societies and almost non-existent in traditional societies. And that's something that's kind of interesting. When we look at kind of the remaining hunter-gatherer groups that exist on the planet, we don't find obesity. Even when we look in the developing world, we don't find a whole lot of obesity, which is really interesting because if you rewind our kind of history just a little bit, going back to medieval Europe and places like that, if you were someone who was obese, then you were someone who was viewed as being successful, right? Because you were able to get so much food that you could acquire that nice rotund form. But today, the kind of definition and the cultural expectations surrounding obesity have shifted quite a bit. So some of the metabolic changes that we see that occur when someone is chronically living under obesity is you have hyperinsulinemia, you have non-insulin dependent diabetes as well as hypertension, you have hyperlipoproteinemia, you have atherosclerosis as well as coronary artery disease, you have cholelithiasis as well as cancer, and you could develop osteoarthritis as well. And you might be asking, why do we have obesity in the world if it, leads to all of these really deleterious side effects? Shouldn't natural selection do something about preventing humans from becoming obese? It's actually natural selection that has caused this obesity. Because as humans, we've gone through recurrent episodes of starvation. Our selection, and we talked about this earlier with some of the genes that we talked about for fat deposition, selection would favor those who can efficiently store fat for later use, right? So selection favored women who had higher fat stores within our species, right? And that's what has really led to the ability for some individuals to have higher fat deposition than others. We also have cultural patterns that have related to and kind of bolstered the idea of obesity. If we look at one particular example, or an example I like to use that's in the non-kind of Western world, we look at steatopegia, which is a sexually selected trend in isolated areas within Africa. So in essence, you have these African tribes in which women who have larger than normal backsides, for lack of a better way to put it, are actually considered the more desirable marriage partners within their communities, right? So those women end up getting married more often, they end up having more children, and they end up passing that increased fat deposition on to the next generation, right? Creating this condition called steatopegia. But the general patterns that we see is in the industrial world, the poor people have higher rates of obesity. People in lower socioeconomic status have higher rates of obesity. But if we turn around to the developing world, our second world nations, more affluent people have higher rates of obesity. So it's kind of interesting. It shows you how much culture and what cultural ideals of beauty play a role in what's considered obese versus not, and who becomes obese versus who doesn't within a various cultural circumstance. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about variances in health systems and kind of how that relates back to the main topic for the course, which is race and racism. We have the Mayan Migrant study on nutrition that was done by Barry Bogan, who took measurements and socioeconomic information from two classes of people in Guatemala, the Ladinos, which are the more wealthy, and the Maya, which are the kind of indigenous people. He observed that first-generation Mayan immigrants and found their heights to be 5.6 centimeters taller than average. So what this does is it shows a real link between environment and stature, right? And remember, we talked about earlier in the semester the experiment that Franz Boas did at Ellis Island. This study by Barry Bogan just further proves what Boas was saying, is that diet and nutrition have a big role in your overall stature and body proportions. So when we talk about racial health disparities, I don't want you to get into the idea, because it's still out there in the mainstream science, that there are diseases that are race specific. That is bad science, in essence, and really is most of those studies are founded off of very, very small sample sizes, which are not accurate reflection of our species as a whole. Where we do see racial health disparities is not in the manifestation of disease, but rather in the access to healthcare, right? So many clinics and hospitals in rural and poor areas are understaffed and under-equipped, right? And the result of this and the result of these disparities is lower on average birth weights for minority parents, right? And there are higher preterm babies are born fewer than 37 weeks in that occurs within these areas that have these huge degrees of unequal access to healthcare. So if we look at just kind of the numbers that came out recently, we have a 13.3% of African American babies born are born underweight, whereas 6.9% of quote unquote white babies born are born underweight. Same groupings, we have 11.5% African American babies are born preterm, whereas 17.5% of white babies are born preterm. So what does that say, right? There is no real biological distinct foundation for this pattern, because look at how contradictory it is. You actually have more of the white children being born preterm, but less of them being born underweight than African American babies, right? So this is saying that there is something not biological, but cultural or technological that is going on that is denying these people regular access to health care, regular access to adequate nutrition, that is causing this pattern to occur on a national scale, right? We in anthropology refer to this as structural violence, when you have these institutions and these systems which create unequal access to things that are needed for everyday life. Another thing that we can look at whether or not there are disparities in access to healthcare are these kind of disparities in mortality. And we're looking at mortality versus morbidity, right? Morbidity refers to the rate of a disease within a population, whereas mortality refers to the rate of death within a population. And disparities will vary greatly depending on the cause of death. In a general sense, African Americans are at a higher risk of dying in many categories, from heart disease to cancers, whereas individuals who are considered Caucasian or white have higher rates of suicide than other quote-unquote racial groupings. So I hope the kind of past couple slides, just looking at two very basic concepts within medicine, not even looking at very, very specific examples. We're just looking at simply patterns in mortality, morbidity, and birth rate. I hope that you have seen that there is something funky going on in terms of these differences, right? That if we were to remove this unequal access to healthcare, I guarantee you we would see these numbers normalize quite a bit, right? And that there wouldn't be these huge disparities between quote unquote racial groupings, right? So there really is no difference in terms of how different racial groupings respond to treatments. There's no diseases that affect one racial grouping exclusively over another, right? So the kind of notion is that as humans, we all share the same fundamental biology, right? So any health strategy that works for one group of humans will work for another group of humans. Where we see these disparities forming, which lead us to believe that there are racial grouping diseases, is not the disease itself, but rather the manifestation of unequal access to healthcare due to cultural and socioeconomic factors, right? So looking at racial medicine as a concept, right, you do have some studies out there that purport to prove a connection between race and disease. Things like the slavery hypertension hypothesis, as well as the post-traumatic slave hypothesis, as well as one that we're going to talk about, which is absolutely absurd, called Drapado Mania, right? And I throw Drapado Mania in there to show you exactly how absurd this notion of linking specific health conditions and very specific diseases to one specific racial grouping or another, right? We as humans should really be addressing our health conditions as a whole rather than trying to figure out which disease affects which group more than the others. So the slavery hypertension hypothesis, I'm not going to go into all the details about who invented this and everything, because I don't want you to put much credence or stock into its validity, because it is not valid. So essentially what this says is that African Americans generally, on average, have higher rates of heart disease and hypertension. And what they were saying is that these individuals, the reason they have these higher rates is because, well, when Africans were being brought as slaves over to the United States, what ended up happening is it caused a bottleneck of population, right? So only those individuals who were more efficient at storing salt and only those individuals who were more efficient at kind of maintaining their salt levels within their bodies were able to make it and survive the journey over to the Americas. So it was only those individuals that ended up passing their genes to the rest of the African American population within North America, and that is why, because of this salt retention, that we have higher degrees of hypertension in African American people in North America. The issue with this is that it does not really account for the fact that, you know, African slaves were not the only people of color that were taken into slavery and brought over to the United States. It doesn't take into account the sheer variation that we see within Africa itself in terms of manifestation of hypertension and things like that. So there's really not a whole lot of concrete validity behind this notion. There is another health condition that you will see called the post-traumatic slave hypothesis or post-traumatic slave condition. This is actually a very interesting kind of manifestation of cultural ideologies on race, right? And what it's really saying is that African Americans deal with some of these stress conditions and these anxiety disorders at a higher rate because of all of the institutional slavery and racism that has been dealt with over the past, you know, for well over a century now. And, you know, there is some interesting data behind this. It shows, you know, that there are kind of higher prevalences of stress-related conditions within African American populations as well as some African populations, but there is no real genetic foundation for this. So post-traumatic slave hypothesis or syndrome is not so much a genetic condition, whereas it is a condition that occurs as a result of kind of structural violence as well as institutional racism, right? So post-traumatic slave hypothesis exists in the sense that it is true that African American populations as well as people of color and other minorities have had to come up with certain adaptive cultural responses to living with slavery and institutional racism. But in terms of those causing real genetic sustainable changes from generation to generation, the evidence just isn't there, right? So what this really is kind of a set of health conditions that are being related to or kind of attributed to the effects of a cultural system. And to throw one from the way past back at you that, in my opinion, is the absolute most ridiculous piece of racial medicine that I've ever come across thus far in my career. It's this notion of Drapado Mania, which occurred in 1851. And what this was really done is it was developed by Samuel Cartwright as a way to kind of explain, or as a way to use science and medicine to explain you know, why slavery is appropriate, right? So he created this condition called Drapado Mania that says if slaves run away from their masters, then they are clearly mentally ill. They suffer from this Drapado Mania. If slaves were complacent, then that meant that they were healthy, right? So what this was really doing was mirroring the kind of social ideas about what slavery is and what is considered, you know, a good versus a bad slave, quote unquote. So what this was done is this is just really used as a way to kind of use medicine to justify the continued existence of slavery. So to start wrapping up here, remember that agriculture and animal domestication exposed ancient humans to a variety of different diseases, which are now still with us today. The adoption of agriculture allowed for nutritional deficiencies disorders to come into being on a more frequent scale. And humans traded individual health essentially for fecundity, or the ability to reproduce and have higher rates of fertility. So remember that health disparities do exist among racial groupings, but race-specific health conditions are a result of historical and cultural conditions rather than that of biology, right? So in summary, kind of human diseases that affect specific quote-unquote races are a result of our collective history, not the result of some fundamental difference in biology, right? In essence, all humans, we have the same fundamental biology, right? It's just our certain cultural conditions and our historical conditions which have allowed for some groups to have a more prevalence of one disease versus another. And it's really this kind of resulting fallout from slavery and institutional racism, which still kind of occurs today, that causes a lot of our modern health disparities to form in a country in which we have one of the best, most modern kind of health systems, right? We still have these huge disparities, right? So something cultural and something institutional is going on to kind of perpetuate this.